Welcome to the Atheist Witch Podcast, a bi-weekly podcast for witches or any curious minds to learn more about a non-theistic approach to witchcraft. Hello, my wonderfully skeptic and curious listeners, and welcome back to the Atheist Witch Podcast. I'm your host, and today we are continuing our deep dive into the major pantheons of human history. We are moving geographically east and chronologically deep into the roots of civilization. Today, we are exploring the Hindu pantheon. Now, this episode is a little different from our explorations of the Celtic or Nordic gods. Unlike those traditions which were largely reconstructed after centuries of dormancy, Hinduism is a living, breathing, vibrant faith practiced by over 1 billion people today. It's arguably the oldest religion in the world that's still in practice. As an atheist witch, approaching a living religion requires very specific kind of respect and nuance. We are not here to adopt theology or claim culture. We aren't setting up a traditional puja or pretending to be Hindu. We are borrowing a verified psychological map. Think of it as the difference between studying a map of a country to understand its terrain versus claiming citizenship there. We're looking at these incredibly complex figures through our specific lens, the lens of Jungian archetypes. In this framework, the Hindu gods and goddesses are not literal spirits floating in the ether. They are profound, millennia-old maps of the human psyche. They represent universal patterns of behavior, personality traits, and psychological states that reside in our own subconscious. If you want to understand the complexity of the human mind, from its capacity for destruction to its ability to enter a flow state, there is perhaps no richer psychological library than this pantheon. As always, to understand these archetypes, we need to take a look at the observable reality from whence they came. The roots of these beliefs stretch back to the Indus Valley civilization, around 3300 to 1300 BCE, in what is now Pakistan and northwest India. This was a sophisticated, urban society. As the Vedic period began around 1500 BCE, we see the composition of the Vedas, ancient texts that shifted the focus from purely elemental worship to complex philosophical inquiry. Crucially, this includes the Rig Veda, one of the oldest extant texts in any Indo-European language. For those of you who remember our deep dive into the history of witchcraft way back in episode 5, you might recall my fascination with the linguistic connection between the Celtic word druid and the Sanskrit word Veda. Both share the root word vid, which means to know or see. And today, we're going straight to the source of that knowledge. The geography here is crucial. This region is defined by the mighty Himalayan mountains, vast river systems like the Ganges and the Indus, and extreme weather cycles with intense monsoons followed by scorching heat. It makes sense that the early deities here were elemental: Agni, fire, and Indra, storms. But as the culture evolved, so did the gods. We moved from the Vedic era into the Puranic periods, where the focus shifted from appeasing nature to understanding the self. We see the rise of the Trimurti, the triad of creation, preservation, and destruction, and the concept of dharma, or cosmic order, and karma, or cause and effect. This evolution is fascinating from a sociological perspective. As society became more structured and philosophical, the gods became less about make it rain and more about how do I navigate the complexity of existence. They became personifications of abstract concepts like time, knowledge, and duty. And for the science-minded witch, this is gold. These aren't just myths. They are early attempts to categorize human psychology and the laws of the universe. There are thousands of deities in this tradition, but we're going to focus on 4 specific figures that act as a powerful psychological pillar for the modern atheist witch. First, we have Ganesha, the elephant-headed deity. Ganesha is widely revered as the remover of obstacles and the lord of beginnings. He is honored at the start of rites and ceremonies to ensure success. Psychologically speaking, Ganesha represents executive function. He's the archetype of cognitive clarity and problem solving. The obstacle he removes is rarely a physical boulder in the road. It's usually mental clutter or the fear of failure or cognitive dissonance that prevents us from starting a task. For the atheist witch, Ganesha is the perfect symbol for overcoming procrastination. When you invoke this archetype, you aren't asking an elephant god to do your homework. You're triggering a mental start sequence. You're acknowledging the difficulty of the task and consciously choosing to clear out your neural pathways of distraction to focus on the next step immediately in front of you. Next is Saraswati, the goddess of knowledge, music, art, and wisdom. She's often depicted dressed in pure white, sitting by a flowing river, playing the veena. She represents the free flow of wisdom and consciousness. Saraswati is the perfect personification of what modern psychology calls the flow state. This is that mental state where you are fully immersed in a feeling of energized focus, full involvement and enjoyment in the process of the activity. She represents intellectual curiosity and the discipline required to master a skill. If you are a writer, an artist, or a student, Saraswati is your focus point. Using her imagery as a way to prime your brain for deep work. It signals to your particular activating system that you are entering a space of learning and creativity, helping you bypass the ego's need for validation and simply exist in the act of creation. Third, let's look at Shiva, the destroyer and the transformer. Shiva is part of the Great Trinity. He destroys the universe at the end of each cycle so that it can be recreated. He's also the lord of yoga and meditation, often depicted in deep stoic trance or dancing the cosmic dance of destruction. Shiva represents the psychological necessity of synaptic pruning. In neuroscience, our brains must destroy old connections to make room for new ones. Shiva is the archetype of radical acceptance and understanding that things must end in order for us to grow. He represents the destruction of the ego and old habits. Use the Shiva archetype for shadow work and breaking addictions or bad habits. He's the reminder that destruction is not evil. It's a necessary biological and psychological process. When you're trying to rewire a behavior, you're engaging in a Shiva-like act of destroying an old neural pathway in order to build a new one. Finally, we have Kali, the often misunderstood fierce goddess of time, change, and destruction. She's often depicted with a garland of skulls, a protruding tongue, and wild hair. She destroys evil forces and consumes the ego. She is the ferocious form of the mother goddess. Kali is the archetype of the fight response in our fight or flight, but channeled specifically for liberation. She represents the confrontation of our deepest fears and the violent dismantling of the illusions that we tell ourselves. She is the raw, unfiltered subconscious survival instinct that cuts through societal politeness to protect the core self. For the atheist witch, Kali is for the moments of extreme crisis or necessary upheaval. When you need to set a hard boundary, leave a toxic situation, or confront a deep-seated trauma, you invoke the Kali archetype. It is permission to be fierce, be loud, and to ruthlessly cut away whatever is killing you. So how do we tie this together without sliding too far into a supernatural belief? It comes down to cognitive framing and priming. In Hinduism, there is a massive emphasis on mantra, the repetition of sacred sounds. While traditionalists believe that the sound itself holds the divine vibration, from a neuroscience perspective, the practice has a measurable effect on the body, actually known as the Sanskrit effect. Neuroscientific studies suggest that the rigorous memorization and rhythmic recitation of complex mantras actually increases the size of brain regions that are associated with cognitive function. specifically the hippocampus. When you repeat a mantra associated with one of these archetypes, you aren't just calling down a spirit, you're engaging in neurological exercise. Furthermore, the rhythmic repetition stimulates the vagus nerve, which regulates our parasympathetic nervous system, which is our rest and digest mode. When you engage in this practice or focus intensely on an image, you are engaging in a form of self-hypnosis or priming. You're instructing your brain to prioritize information and behaviors that align with your chosen archetype. For example, if you focus on Ganesha before a work session to remove obstacles, you are priming your brain to look for solutions rather than problems. If you focus on the stillness of Shiva during meditation, you're giving your brain a visual anchor to return to when that default mode network, your chatterbox brain, tries to take over. The magic isn't in the deity. The magic is in the biofeedback loop that you're creating between your conscious intention and your subconscious mind, using these ancient, potent symbols as the interface. To close out today, I want to give you a practical method to test this out. We're going to do what I'm calling a Ganesha Threshold Ritual. And you don't need a statue, you just need a doorway in your home and a small physical object. You can use a stone or a paperweight or even a book. First, choose a task that you've been procrastinating on. Maybe you're getting ready to write another podcast episode. Next, stand outside the doorway of the room where you need to do the task. Place your physical object on the floor right in the middle of the doorway. The object represents the blockage, the fear, boredom, anxiety, whatever's bothering you. Now walk forward and physically stop at that threshold. Close your eyes. Visualize the archetype of Ganesha, or simply the concept of a heavy, immovable object being lifted effortlessly aside. Bend down, pick up that object, and move it over. Take a deep breath, and as you exhale, physically step across the threshold with that conscious intention in mind that the resistance has been physically moved and the mental obstacle is gone. Immediately begin your task, if only for 5 minutes. Try this and see if the physical act of moving the token and crossing the threshold can help change your mental state. That's all for this week's dive into the Hindu Pantheon. Remember, these are tools for your mind, honed by thousands of years of human experience. Join me next week when we explore the Abrahamic archetypes from an outsider's perspective. Until then, keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep making your own magic.